The wind shrieked through the Montana night, shattering John Malone's solitude as a chilling cry pierced the monstrous blizzard. The lone rancher plunged into the freezing dark, only to stumble upon a heart-stopping sight. 8 trembling bear cubs, motherless, teetering on the edge of doom. Were they calling to him, or was death closing in? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The wind screamed through the Montana night, a feral howl that clawed at the edges of John Malone's sanity. It battered the cabin walls, shaking the warped wooden shutters like they might rip free and vanish into the storm. Inside, the fire flickered weakly in the stone hearth, casting jagged shadows across the room. A room too quiet, too empty, for too damn long. John sat hunched in his chair, a cracked mug of coffee cooling in his hands, steam curling upward like the ghost of something lost. 5 years since Ellen's laugh had filled this place. 5 years since Matt had packed his bags for the city, leaving nothing but echoes and a father too stubborn to follow. Now it was just John, the creak of the floorboards, and Rusty, his old border collie, sprawled by the fire with graying fur and watchful eyes. Tonight, though, the silence felt wrong. Heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Outside, the blizzard raged, a beast of ice and fury, tearing through the pine-covered hills that loomed over the ranch. John's family had carved this land from the wilderness generations ago, and he'd always found a strange comfort in its isolation. The crunch of snow under his boots, the snap of a frozen branch. These were his hymns, but not tonight. Tonight, the wind didn't just howl, it carried something else, something alive. Rusty's head jerked up, ears twitching, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What's got you spooked, boy?" John muttered, setting the mug down with a thud. The dog's eyes locked on the door, hackles rising, and then it came. A sound so faint it might have been a trick of the storm. A cry, high-pitched, desperate, slicing through the wind like a shard of glass. John froze, his pulse quickening. "You hear that too?" he asked, voice rough with disuse. Rusty barked, sharp and urgent, paws scrabbling against the floor as he lunged toward the door. John's stomach twisted. He wasn't one for ghost stories. Ellen had been the dreamer, not him. But that cry wasn't human. It wasn't cattle either. His herd was safe in the barn, or so he hoped. Whatever it was out there, alone in the dark, and it was dying. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to him. "Stay put," he told Rusty, grabbing his coat from the hook. The fabric was stiff with cold as he yanked it on, shoving his feet into boots crusted with yesterday's snow. He snatched the flashlight from the shelf, its beam cutting a shaky line through the dim room, and threw the door open. The wind hit him like a fist, slamming into his chest, stealing his breath. Snow stung his face, 1,000 tiny needles biting at his skin. He squinted into the blackness, the world beyond the porch reduced to a swirling void of white. "Hello?" he shouted, voice swallowed by the gale. Nothing, just the relentless roar of the storm. Then, there it was again, the cry. Louder now, a chorus of frail, trembling wails rising above the chaos. Rusty barked behind him, paws thumping the threshold, but John waved him back. "Stay, damn it!" he snapped, stepping into the blizzard. The snow was knee-deep, clinging to his legs like wet cement as he trudged forward. Each step was a battle, the cold sinking into his bones, clawing at the scars of old injuries. Shrapnel from a war he'd barely survived, a life he'd buried with Ellen. The flashlight beam danced wildly, catching glimpses of skeletal trees bending under the wind's assault. The cries grew sharper, pulling him toward the barn, then past it, to the ragged edge of his property where the forest took over. "Who's out there?" he yelled, lungs burning. No answer, only the wind, mocking him with its endless scream. Then he saw them. His boots skidded to a halt, snow crunching beneath him as the flashlight beam landed on a sight that stopped his heart. There, at the base of a gnarled pine, huddled in a pitiful heap, were 8 tiny shapes. Bear cubs. Their fur was matted with ice, their bodies quaking so violently they seemed to blur against the snow. 8 pairs of eyes, small, glassy, barely open, stared up at him, pleading. No mother, no tracks. Just them, alone, abandoned in a storm that would bury them alive by morning. "Oh, Jesus," John breathed, the words fogging in the frigid air. He dropped to his knees, the cold seeping through his jeans, numbing his legs. He'd seen death before. Too much of it. Ellen's pale face in the hospital bed, her hand slipping from his. The telegram about his brother in Nam. But this was different. These cubs weren't just dying. They were fighting to live, and they'd found him. Him, of all people. A man who'd spent years running from life, hiding in this god-forsaken corner of Montana, where the world couldn't touch him. He swept the light around, searching for the mother. Nothing. No blood, no prints, no sign of a fight. Just the cubs, their whimpers tearing at him like hooks. "Where's your mama?" he murmured, voice cracking. The smallest one, a runt, barely bigger than his hand, let out a feeble squeak, and something inside John broke. He couldn't leave them. Not here. Not like this. He tore off his coat, the wind slashing at his exposed skin, and scooped up as many cubs as he could fit in his arms. 3, maybe 4, their icy fur pressed against his chest, their trembling bodies so fragile he feared they'd shatter. "Hang on," he whispered, staggering to his feet. The others wailed behind him and he cursed under his breath. "I'll come back for you." I swear he turned, the flashlight slipping in his grip, and ran. The cabin loomed ahead, a faint glow in the storm, and Rusty's barking guided him home. He burst through the door, snow spilling across the floor, and dropped to his knees by the hearth. The cubs tumbled from his arms, limp and shivering, their cries now faint gasps. "Rusty, move!" he barked, shoving logs onto the fire until it roared to life. Heat flooded the room, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He grabbed a blanket from the couch, wrapping it around the cubs he'd carried, then bolted back into the night. The wind screamed louder, as if enraged by his defiance, but John didn't care. He stumbled through the snow, breath ragged, flashlight beam bouncing. The remaining cubs were still there, piled together, weaker now. He gathered them up, 2 in each arm, their cold seeping into him like a warning, and ran again, legs burning, chest heaving. Back inside, he collapsed by the fire, laying the last of them beside their siblings. 8 tiny lives trembling under his hands, their whimpers filling the cabin with a sound he hadn't heard in years. Need. John sank back, staring at them, his breath hitching. Rusty nosed closer, sniffing the cubs with wary curiosity, then lay down beside them, a guardian in the flickering light. "What the hell am I supposed to do with you?" John rasped, rubbing a hand over his face. The storm pounded the walls, a reminder of the death waiting outside. But in here, something else was stirring. Something alive. Something that wouldn't let him turn away. He didn't know it yet, but those cubs, those fragile, impossible creatures, had just cracked open the shell he'd built around himself. And as the fire snapped and the wind howled, John Malone felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The fire roared in the hearth, its heat clawing back the cold that clung to John Malone's skin. He knelt there, breathless, snow melting into puddles around him. The 8 bare cubs sprawled across the blanket like a fragile constellation of life. Their whimpers had softened, but each sound still stabbed at him, a plea he couldn't ignore. Rusty lay beside them, his gray muzzle resting near the smallest cub, eyes flicking between the tiny creatures and John, as if asking the same question echoing in his master's mind. What now? The storm outside battered the cabin, a relentless drumbeat against the walls. But in here, time seemed to hold its breath. John's hands shook as he rubbed the cubs' matted fur, coaxing warmth into their trembling bodies. Their eyes fluttered open, small dark pools glinting with fear and confusion, and he felt a jolt, like a current running straight to his core. "You're a tough bunch, aren't you?" he murmured, voice thick with something he couldn't name. He hadn't planned this. He'd spent years perfecting solitude, building walls of routine and silence to keep the world at bay. Ellen's death had hollowed him out, and Matt's leaving had sealed the tomb. Yet here he was, tethered to these helpless things, their survival dangling by a thread he'd somehow caught. He stood, joints creaking, and shuffled to the kitchen. The cubs needed food, something, anything to keep them going. His mind raced, practical now, shoving panic aside. Milk. He had condensed milk in the pantry, a relic from Ellen's baking days. He grabbed a can, hands fumbling with the opener, and poured the thick, sweet liquid into a shallow dish. The cubs stirred as he set it down, tiny noses twitching, and one by one they dragged themselves forward. The largest cub, broad-shouldered even now, reached it first, lapping greedily, and John couldn't help but chuckle, a rusty sound that startled him. "Max," he said, the name slipping out unbidden. "You're Max." The others followed, clumsy and eager, tumbling over each other in a tangle of paws and fur. The smallest, the runt, hung back, her movements sluggish, her squeaks faint. "Come on, little one," John coaxed, nudging the dish closer. She managed a few laps before collapsing, exhausted, and he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. "Daisy," he whispered, her name a soft echo of Ellen's favorite flower. Her warmth seeped into him, fragile but real, and for a moment, the cabin didn't feel so empty. Hours bled into dawn, the storm's fury dulling to a low growl. John rigged a pen from old crates and straw, a makeshift haven by the fire. The cubs huddled together, a pile of soft snores and twitching limbs, and he watched them, coffee forgotten, a strange ache blooming in his chest. Rusty nosed his hand, whining softly, and John scratched the dog's ears. "They're not staying, boy," he said, more to himself than the collie. "I'll call Wildlife Services tomorrow. They'll know what to do." But the words felt hollow, a lie he wasn't sure he believed. Sleep wouldn't come. He sat by the fire, shadows dancing across his weathered face, memories creeping in like thieves. Ellen's voice warm and teasing, telling him he was too soft for his own good. Matt's teenage defiance, the last fight before he'd stormed off to the city. John had buried himself in this ranch to escape those ghosts, tending cattle with a mechanical numbness that kept him sane. Now these cubs had torn that apart, dragging him back to a place he'd forgotten, where he could feel, where he could care, and it terrified him. The next day blurred into chaos. The cubs woke hungry, their cries sharper, more demanding. John stumbled through feeding them, milk staining his shirt, straw scattering across the floor. Max led the charge, bold and curious, nosing at everything, while Daisy clung to her siblings, shy and frail. Jasper, a wiry troublemaker, tipped over the dish, and Bella, with her wide eyes, pawed at John's leg until he lifted her into his lap. Each name stuck, each personality carving a space in his mind, and he hated how natural it felt. "You're not mine," he muttered, setting Bella down. "You're wild. You don't belong here." But doubt gnawed at him. What if wildlife didn't come? What if they couldn't take 8 cubs in the dead of winter? He wasn't equipped for this. Hell, he barely kept himself together some days. Yet as night fell, the cubs tumbling around the cabin like they owned it, Rusty herding them with patient nudges, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. Laughter. It bubbled up, rough and raw, as Jasper wrestled with Max and Daisy watched from the sidelines. The loneliness that had choked him for so long loosened its grip just a little. Then it happened. He'd stepped outside to check the barn, the cold biting at his face when Rusty's frantic barking shattered the quiet. John's heart lurched, boots pounding the snow as he raced back. The door banged open, and he stopped dead. The cubs were in chaos, Max pacing, Jasper yowling, Bella pressed against the pen. But Daisy lay still, her tiny body limp on the blanket, breaths shallow and ragged. "No!" John rasped, dropping beside her. His hands shook as he lifted her, her warmth fading, her eyes half closed. "No, no, no! Hang on, sweetheart!" Panic clawed at him, a tidal wave of fear and memory. Ellen on that hospital bed, slipping away as he begged her to stay. He couldn't lose this one too. Not Daisy, not now. He stumbled to the closet, yanking out the old vet kit Ellen had used for the ranch animals. Rusted tools, faded bottles, a lifeline from a past he couldn't escape. "Come on," he muttered, rifling through it, hands trembling so hard he nearly dropped the syringe. Antibiotics. He found a vial, prayed it wasn't expired, and drew the dose with a precision born of desperation. He worked fast, cradling Daisy, her frail squeaks tearing at his soul. The needle pierced her skin, and she flinched, a tiny fighter even now. "You're tougher than you look," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. He wrapped her in his flannel shirt, tucking her against his chest, and sat by the fire, rocking her gently. The other cubs watched, silent as if they knew. Rusty pressed close, his head on John's knee, and time stretched thin, each second a battle between hope and dread. Hours later, her breathing steadied, a faint rhythm against his heartbeat. John exhaled, a sob catching in his throat. "That's it, Daisy girl," he said, voice breaking. "You're not giving up on me." The cabin settled around them, the fire's glow softening the edges of the night. But John knew this was just the beginning. These cubs weren't just a burden anymore. They were his. And as the storm growled outside, he realized he'd fight for them, no matter what came next. The fire crackled in the cabin, a steady pulse against the storm's fading growl. John Malone slumped in his chair, Daisy nestled in his lap, her tiny chest rising and falling with a fighter's stubborn rhythm. The antibiotics had worked, for now, and the other cubs slept in their straw-lined pen, a tangle of fur and soft snores. Rusty sprawled nearby, ears twitching at every creak, a silent sentinel in the dim light. John's eyes burned, exhaustion tugging at him, but sleep was a distant dream. The cubs had survived another night, and that was enough to keep him going. Days blurred into a chaotic rhythm, feeding, cleaning, watching. Max grew bolder, nosing at the cabin's corners, while Jasper's mischief turned the pen into a battlefield of scattered straw. Bella clung to John's shadow, her wide eyes tracking his every move, and Daisy, sweet Daisy, stayed close to her siblings, fragile but alive. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, thrummed with life, and John felt it seeping into him, cracking the walls he'd built around his heart. He'd meant to call wildlife services, but the phone stayed untouched, the idea of letting them go growing heavier each day. "Just a little longer," he told Rusty, scratching the dog's ears. "They need me." Then she came. It was dusk, the sky bruised purple, the air sharp with the promise of more snow. John was hauling firewood from the shed when Rusty's bark split the quiet, low, urgent, a warning. He dropped the logs, wood clattering into the snow, and turned. His breath caught. There, at the edge of the property, stood a bear. Massive. Her fur gleamed dark against the fading light, her eyes locked on the cabin with an intensity that pinned him in place. Matilda. He didn't know how he knew her name, but it fit. Regal, fierce, a mother's shadow in the wilderness. "Easy, girl," he whispered, hands raised, heart hammering. She didn't move, didn't growl, just watched. The cub's mother? It had to be. But why now? Why here? The storm had stolen her tracks that first night, left no trace of her fate. Had she been searching all this time? Rusty growled, hackles up, and John grabbed his collar. "Stay," he hissed, eyes never leaving her. Matilda took a step closer, her massive paws sinking into the snow, and John's mind raced. If she wanted her cubs, she'd come for them, and he wasn't sure he could stop her. The next morning, Dr. Emily Carter arrived. Word had spread, small towns loved a story, and the wildlife biologist's truck crunched up the icy driveway, her boots leaving prints beside Matilda's. John met her at the door, Daisy in his arms, the cub's warmth a quiet anchor. "You're the bear guy, huh?" Emily said, her smile warm but sharp-edged, like she'd seen too much to be fooled. "John," he corrected, stepping aside. "And yeah, I guess I am." She strode in, eyes lighting up at the cubs tumbling in their pen. "They're thriving," she said, kneeling to examine them. "You've done a hell of a job." Her praise hit him like a punch, but he shrugged it off. "They're fighters. I just didn't let them die." Emily's gaze softened, then sharpened again. "There's a female out there. Saw her tracks. She's been circling. You know what that means?" John nodded, throat tight. Matilda. I saw her last night. Emily's brow furrowed. Matilda, huh? She might be their mother. Might not. Either way, she's a problem. These cubs can't stay here forever, John. They're wild. Her words stung, echoing his own doubts, but he bristled. They're not ready. Daisy almost didn't make it. What if... Emily cut him off, voice firm. What if she takes them? Or worse, rejects them? You're not equipped for this. I'll help. But we need a plan. The plan came fast. An outdoor enclosure behind the barn, a step toward the wild. John threw himself into it, hammering boards, rigging climbing logs, his hands raw and bleeding by noon. Emily worked beside him, her quiet competence steadying his nerves. The cubs explored it that afternoon, hesitant at first, then racing across the snow with clumsy joy. John watched from the fence, an ache twisting in his gut. He missed Bella's weight in his lap, Max's nudges, but Emily was right. They weren't his, not really. Then Jasper bolted. It happened in a flash. John turned to grab a tool and the wiry cub slipped through a gap in the fence. Jasper, he yelled, voice cracking. The cub darted toward the creek, a blur of fur against the white. Rusty barked, tearing after him, and John followed, boots slipping, heart in his throat. The creek loomed ahead, ice-crusted and treacherous, and Jasper hit it hard. A yelp, a splash. He was in thrashing, the current dragging him under. No, John roared, plunging in. The cold bit like knives, slicing through his jeans, numbing his legs. Water surged to his thighs, ice cracking under his weight. Jasper flailed, eyes wide with terror, and John lunged, arms closing around the cub's soaked body. He yanked him free, stumbling back to shore, gasping, shivering. You little bastard, he rasped, clutching Jasper close, the cub's whimpers shaking them both. Rusty nosed at them, whining, as John sank to his knees, snow soaking his coat. Emily found them there, her face pale. Jesus, John, you could have... She stopped, shaking her head. The enclosure's not secure. We can't let that happen again. Her scolding burned, but he knew she was right. He'd been careless, too caught up in saving them to see the risks. I'll fix it, he said, voice low, Jasper trembling in his arms. I won't lose them. That night, Matilda returned. John heard her first, a low huff outside, a shadow shifting beyond the porch. He grabbed his rifle, stepping out, breath fogging in the chill. She stood near the enclosure, closer now, her bulk a silent threat. The cubs stirred inside, squeaking, sensing her. John's grip tightened on the gun, but he didn't raise it. You want them back? He whispered, voice trembling. They're yours, but they're mine too. Matilda's eyes met his, unreadable, and then she turned, melting into the dark. John stood there, rifle heavy in his hands, the cubs' cries echoing behind him. Emily's words rang in his head. They're wild, but so was Matilda, and she'd come for them. He didn't know if she'd take them or kill them, didn't know if he could let her try. All he knew was the storm had brought them together, and now something bigger was closing in, something he couldn't outrun. The cabin glowed softly in the pre-dawn hush, the fire reduced to embers that cast a warm, fleeting light across the room. John Malone sat by the enclosure's window, his breath fogging the glass, eyes fixed on the shadowed outline of Matilda beyond the fence. She'd come again, as she had every night since that rifle-clenched standoff, her massive form a silent promise, or a threat, etched against the snow. Inside, the cubs slept, their tiny bodies pressed together in the straw, oblivious to the pull of the wild circling closer. Rusty whined at John's feet, sensing the shift, and John rested a hand on the dog's head. I know, boy, he murmured. It's time. Time. The word hung heavy, a stone in his chest. He'd fought for these cubs, through the blizzard's teeth, Daisy's fever, Jasper's plunge into the creek, and now he had to let them go. Emily's voice echoed in his mind, steady and sure. They're wild, John. They belong out there. She'd been right from the start, but knowing it didn't dull the ache. Max's bold nudges, Bella's quiet trust, Jasper's chaos, Daisy's fragile courage. They'd filled the hollows Ellen's death and Matt's absence had carved out. And Matilda? She was their truth, their future, a mother he couldn't replace. Emily arrived with the sunrise, her truck rumbling up the drive, a crate of supplies rattling in the back. She stepped out, breath puffing in the crisp air, and met his gaze with a nod. "You ready?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. John shrugged, hands stuffed in his pockets, Daisy's warmth still a ghost against his chest. "Doesn't matter if I am. They are." She studied him, then smiled, a small, knowing thing, and hauled a toolbox from the truck. "Let's make this work then." They expanded the enclosure that day, adding a gate, a threshold between John's world and Matilda's. The cubs explored it with wary curiosity, Max scaling a log while Jasper pawed at the fence, testing its limits. John watched from a distance, hammer idle in his hand, the ache spreading. Emily worked beside him, her presence a quiet lifeline. "You've done more than most would," she said, tightening a bolt. "They're strong because of you." He grunted, eyes on Daisy as she nosed at a patch of snow. "Strong enough to leave me." The first meeting came that afternoon. Matilda approached the fence, her breath steaming in the cold, and the cubs froze, their squeaks cutting through the silence. John held his breath, fingers clenched around a mug of coffee gone cold. Max edged forward, sniffing, his boldness faltering under her gaze. She huffed, a low, rumbling sound, and nudged the fence with her snout. The cubs flinched, then crept closer, Daisy lagging behind, her tiny frame trembling. "She's testing them," Emily whispered, crouched beside John. "Give it time." Time stretched, slow and agonizing. Matilda visited daily, her presence a ritual now, sniffing, watching, waiting. The cubs grew braver, Max pressing his nose to hers through the bars, Bella tumbling after him. John watched it unfold, a knot tightening in his throat. He stopped holding them, stopped feeding them by hand, each step back a cut he forced himself to bear. Rusty bridged the gap, nosing the cubs toward the fence, his loyalty torn between them and John. "Good boy," John rasped, voice thick, as the dog herded Jasper back from a reckless dash. One evening, Emily sat with him on the porch, the sun bleeding orange across the hills. "You think she'll take them?" he asked, staring at the enclosure where Matilda lingered, her eyes glinting in the dusk. Emily sipped her coffee, slow and thoughtful. "I think she's ready. They're responding to her. It's instinct." John nodded, the weight settling deeper. "And if she doesn't?" Her silence was answer enough. Rejection meant death, or a life they weren't built for. "We'll figure it out," she said finally, her hand brushing his arm, a fleeting warmth he clung to. The gate opened a week later. John's hands shook as he unlatched it, the metal cold against his skin. Matilda hesitated, her bulk filling the threshold, then stepped inside with a grunt. The cubs stilled, quivering, their eyes wide. Max moved first, tentative, then Daisy, brave little Daisy, stumbled forward, squeaking. Matilda sniffed them, her massive paw gentle as she nudged them closer. John's heart swelled, tears pricking his eyes. "She knows them," Emily breathed, her voice catching. "She's taking them back." The reunion unfolded in quiet chaos, nuzzles, squeals, Matilda's low rumbles weaving through it all. John stood back, fists clenched, pride and pain warring inside him. They recognized her, their fear melting into something primal, something right. For days, she led them around the enclosure, teaching them, climbing, foraging, surviving. John watched from the porch, a shadow in his own story, the cabin growing emptier with each lesson. The release came too soon. Emily had scouted a reserve, miles of untamed land, safe from hunters, and they loaded Matilda and the cubs into a trailer, a task of coaxing and patience. John stood by the door, hand on the latch, the cubs' squeaks muffled inside. "You'll watch them, won't you?" he asked Emily, voice barely a whisper. She squeezed his shoulder, steady as ever. "I promise, they'll be okay." He nodded, throat tight, and stepped back as the truck pulled away, dust and snow swirling in its wake. Rusty pressed against his leg, whining, and John sank to the porch steps, watching the trailer vanish over the hill. The silence hit hard, thicker, heavier than before. The fire still burned inside, but its warmth felt distant, a memory of chaos and life now gone. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking, and let the grief come. Not just for the cubs, but for Ellen, for Matt, for the man he'd been before that blizzard night. They'd saved him as much as he'd saved them, and now they were gone. Emily lingered that night, her quiet presence a balm. "You did good, John," she said, sitting beside him, the stars piercing the dark above. He managed a crooked smile, raw and real. "Yeah, guess I did." The cabin creaked around them, a shell he'd rebuild, but not alone. Not anymore. Matilda and the cubs were out there, wild and free, and he'd given them that. It was enough, almost. The first snow of the new season drifted down in lazy flakes, dusting the porch where John Malone stood, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. The ranch stretched out before him, a silent expanse of white framed by the pine-dark hills, the air sharp and clean. Inside, the cabin hummed with a quiet he hadn't known in months. No squeaks, no tumbling paws, just the crackle of the fire and Rusty's soft snores by the hearth. The cubs were gone, Max, Daisy, Jasper, Bella, and the rest, carried off with Matilda into the wild heart of the reserve. Yet their absence didn't feel like loss. Not entirely. It felt like a door left ajar, a whisper of something unfinished. Weeks had passed since the trailer's dust settled, since Emily's hand on his shoulder had steadied him through the goodbye. John had thrown himself into the ranch, rebuilding the barn, planting a garden under the thawing spring sun, even taking in a scrappy tabby cat that wandered up one dusk, her green eyes glinting with a survivor's grit. Rusty had grumbled at first, but now the two curled together by the fire, a small, stubborn family. John watched them sometimes, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and wondered how he'd ever thought this place could stay empty. Emily came often, her visits a rhythm he hadn't expected to need. She'd bring photos, blurry shots of the cubs clambering over logs, Matilda's hulking shape in the distance, and they'd sit on the porch, coffee cooling between them, trading stories. "They're thriving," she'd said one afternoon, tapping a picture of Daisy perched on a branch, her once frail frame sturdy now. "Matilda's a hell of a teacher." John had nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "They're tougher than I thought," he'd replied, then grinned, rough and rare. Guess they had to bear it. Her laughter had warmed him, a sound that lingered long after she drove off. What had started as a partnership, her expertise, his desperation, had softened into something else. Friendship, maybe more, though John didn't name it. Didn't need to. She'd sit close some nights, her shoulder brushing his, and he'd feel the ghosts of Ellen and Matt shift. Not gone, but quieter, making room. He wasn't the man he'd been before the blizzard. Hollowed out, hiding. He was something new, cracked open and healing. The story didn't stay small. A local news crew had called one crisp fall morning, their voices crackling through the old rotary phone. "Heard you saved some bears, Mr. Malone. Care to share?" Reluctant, he'd agreed, more for the cubs than himself. The segment aired a week later. Grainy footage of the enclosure, a shot of him with Rusty, the mountains stark behind them. Letters followed, then emails. A flood of voices from strangers who'd watched, wept, cheered. "You gave them a chance," one read. "Reminded me to keep going," said another. John read them by the fire, hands steady, a knot loosening he hadn't known was there. He'd started a YouTube channel after that, urged by Emily's quiet nudge. The first video was simple. Him on the porch, Rusty at his side, the wind tugging at his graying hair. "Hi folks," he'd said, voice low but firm. "I'm John Malone. This is a story about 8 bear cubs, a blizzard, and how a little kindness can change everything." He'd told it all. The storm's fury, Daisy's fight, Matilda's shadow, his words rough-hewn but honest. At the end, he'd looked into the camera, eyes steady. We're all connected, humans, animals, this land. So here's a question. What's one thing you can do today to make it better? Tell me, I'd like to know. It went viral. Millions watched, shared, commented, stories of small acts rippling outward. A chain he'd never meant to start. A kid planting a tree, a woman feeding strays, A man rebuilding a neighbor's fence. John scrolled through them some nights, the glow of the screen lighting his weathered face, and felt the weight of it. Not pride, not quite, just a quiet awe that those cubs, those fragile lives he'd pulled from the snow, had sparked something bigger than him. Winter crept in, the snow thickening, and John found a new rhythm. He'd walk the ranch at dawn, boots crunching, the tabby, named Sage, trailing him like a shadow. Rusty would limp along, slower now but stubborn as ever. The enclosure stood empty behind the barn, its gate creaking in the wind, a relic of chaos and love. He'd pause there sometimes, tracing the claw marks Max had left, and wonder, were they safe? Did Matilda still watch over them? Did Daisy still climb? Jasper still roam? One night the wind picked up, a familiar howl rattling the shutters. John stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, the cold biting at his knuckles. The hills loomed dark, their edges blurred by falling snow, and then he heard it, a sound, faint but piercing, carried on the gale. A growl, a call. He froze, breath hitching, straining to listen. It came again, distant, wild, threading through the storm like a thread he couldn't grasp. Matilda? The cubs? Or just the wind playing tricks on a man who'd given too much of his heart? He didn't know. Maybe he never would. The sound faded, swallowed by the night, and John stood there, snow dusting his shoulders, the mug trembling in his grip. Rusty nosed the door open, whining, and Sage's eyes glinted from the threshold. "Coming," he muttered, turning back, but his gaze lingered on the hills. The cubs were out there somewhere, and so was a piece of him, wild, free, unbroken. Inside, the fire snapped, warm and alive. Emily would come tomorrow, her truck crunching up the drive, and they'd talk, maybe laugh, maybe sit in silence. The world would turn, snow would fall, and John would keep going. Changed, not finished. He shut the door, the wind's howl muffled, but that sound, that echo stayed with him. A question without an answer, a hope without end. And so John Malone's journey with those 8 bear cubs comes to a close, but its echo lingers. A tale not just of survival, but of compassion, of how one small act can ripple out and transform the world. From a frozen cabin in a Montana blizzard to the distant hills where Matilda led her cubs home, John found hope. And through him, millions glimpsed light in their own lives. That faint sound in the stormy night, real or imagined, reminds us that nature and humanity are bound together, forever in need of each other. If this story stirred something in you, let it inspire you as it did me. Don't miss out. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to uncover more incredible journeys, moments that touch the soul, because every story is a reminder that kindness can change everything. Hit that subscribe button today and join me on this adventure.